welcome back to another episode of The Road Chose Me. My name's Dan, and today we've driven out into the desert to get some practice driving in the sand and be ready for when we cross some of the major deserts in Australia. So we've driven over to the western side of Victoria now. We're over here in a national park called Little Desert. There's also Big Desert. There's a couple more in the area that we may get to in the next few days as we roam around. So we've been told this desert has lots of sand driving, and it's actually really good practice for when we want to cross the Simpson Desert later on when it isn't so hot and it isn't raining up there so much. So we're diving into the desert. We'll be wild camping, we're exploring. Come along, let's see what we find as we explore Big and Little Desert National Parks. So we've just turned off the good gravel road and we're about to drive down what should start to be a pretty interesting sandy track. And of course I am expecting deep sand in here, and so it's time to air down the tires. I really like to air them down not only to get more traction so I don't get stuck, it just makes it easier on the whole machine. Things won't be bouncing around so much, everything just goes smoother. And so this is the first time actually I've had the Gladiator in sand like this, first time I'm airing down the tires. So I don't know for sure what I should go down to. In the Wrangler I drove around Africa, I would often go down to about 24 PSI in the rear and about 22 in the front. There was more weight on the rear than the front, that's why I wouldn't go as low. I don't think the Gladiator yet is as heavy as that Wrangler that I had. I haven't had it on a scale, that's coming up soon when I figure out the suspension. So for now, I think I'll probably go down to about 26 in the rear, maybe the same in the front. And I'll try that and just see how I go, see how much sidewall bulge there is, see how much grip I get. And obviously if I start getting stuck in the sand, I'll go a little bit lower, but I'm gonna start out at that and see how it goes. And people always ask if I've got a fancy gadget or anything like that to air down. The answer is no, I don't. I don't love fancy gadgets. I feel like I just lose them, or they're just something to break or lose track of. And so actually I just have a really simple little tire gauge, and on the side, it just has the little guy that you can jam into the valve to let the air down. And I'm perfectly happy to walk around and air down all 4 tires. Yes, it takes me 6 minutes longer than someone that has a little automatic gadget, but that's 6 minutes where I can have a drink of water, I can listen to the birds. I can also, while I'm down here, have a bit of a look and a listen to the Jeep as well. Just glance at the suspension, look at the brakes, make sure nothing's dripping out from underneath. Always a really good idea, just be checking on your vehicle every chance you get. So let's air down the tires and get into the sand. Good morning everyone. It is bright and early and I thought I'd just show you around this campsite that we found last night. And so here in Little Desert National Park, there's a couple of campsites that you pay for. I think it's like $12 a night or something. But of course, me being me, I prefer to come to the free ones. And so where we are now, this is officially a free campsite. And so it has basically no facilities whatsoever. But you can see it has a beautiful big area where no problem at all to camp anywhere you want. There's a couple of old rundown picnic tables, there's little fire rings. Although interesting to note, at this time of year now, there's a total fire ban here. And so absolutely cannot have a fire, even though there's fire rings provided. And here's our little camp for the night. So somehow the rain keeps following us. Everywhere we go, it rains, even though we're in the desert right now. And so this, I think, will be the habit that we develop, is we've just tucked the swag under the awning. And so that way the swag itself didn't get any rain on it last night. I mean, it's really easy to roll it up and keep it dry and all that stuff. But we slept really well last night. It was a stunning sunset. And then we're just setting up now. We've got tea and coffee on the go, because what would the day be without tea and coffee? And then this is where we were, or this is where we are right now, in this beautiful, they're calling this Broughton's watering hole. And so you can see there is kind of a little, well, I mean, some people might call that a lake, but here in Australia, I guess it's called a watering hole. And it's more or less just a small amount of water that, for whatever reason, is still here, hasn't evaporated away yet. You can see it's absolutely beautiful here. The birds put on a ridiculously loud display this morning, as they seem to do every morning about an hour before sunrise. And the weather does seem like it's going to hold today. It'll be a little windy, but probably no rain. So we're just going to keep exploring Little Desert National Park. And then we think now, we've seen most of this park, we think we're going to cut up. There's a few paved roads between here and then we jump into Big Desert National Park. And it does seem much larger and like a lot more wilderness. So we're excited to get up there and look around. That's what's coming next. So we've just stopped here on the side of the track for lunch and trying to find some shade. We found a spot here with more trees. And I have to say, the fridge has changed my world compared to my Alaska to Argentina trip where I didn't have a fridge. You know, today it's warm. I can tell that Katie and I are not used to the Australian sun. This is not hot by any measure in Australia, but for us it feels pretty warm. So it's so nice to have the fridge so we can have our big water bottle always in the fridge. And then of course, in terms of food, I just made myself a sandwich here. I've got lettuce, ham, tomato, cheese, cucumbers, all of it just came out of the fridge. So all of it's cold and fresh. And so biting into that on a hot day, that definitely makes me a very happy little overlander. And of course the kitchen's coming soon, which is just going to bring all of this to the next level. And you can see where we are here. We found a spot, this is called the red gum swamp. And I guess the red gum is the type of gum tree here that I'm surrounded by. And I was saying to Katie, I grew up just a couple of hours from here, although I haven't been back in about 18 years. Mum and Dad sold that house that I grew up in and Dad lives somewhere else now. And so this kind of landscape, this sort of barrenness that sticks on the ground, the birds that are chirping, absolutely everything that I'm looking at, This reminds me so much of my childhood. And it's kind of funny, I keep saying to Katie, I'm like, oh, it's not very interesting, it's not very nice. But Katie thinks it is, and I imagine some of you guys will as well, simply because you've never seen it, because to you guys, this is kind of exotic or this is kind of different. But for me, this is what I think of when I think of Australian bush. We're not actually close to the Murray River right now, but this is more or less what it looks like. And I spent a lot of my childhood there, fishing on the river, camping with friends from high school. And so this right now, I just feel like I've gone back in time 20 years. I feel like I'm 16 again, 17 again. Dad used to drive us out, three of us, two of my friends and I. He would drive us out to somewhere for a weekend. We would camp Friday night, Saturday night, and then Sunday afternoon, one of the other dads would drive out to pick us up again. And we'd fish, we'd swim in the river, we'd cause all kinds of trouble, have fires at night. And yeah, so it's pretty strange to be back here in this. And I was telling my brother that that's where I was coming, and he just shook his head and said, why would you want to go back there? He said, Dan, we grew up in a hot, dry, dusty place. Why would you want to go and visit a hot, dry, dusty place? Which is pretty funny. But yeah, this is our lunch stop. We're just chilling out. It's nice to be in the shade. And then we're going to get back on the road and just keep exploring this little desert national park, see what else we can find. There's definitely some weather on the horizon. You can see those big clouds are just brewing. Yesterday it rained fairly heavily, and the forecast says it probably will again today, although maybe not so much. So let's see what we find. Just driving along the trail here, and things are getting sandy. It's getting really interesting, but I've just seen something I want to show you guys. That is this particular tree right here. You might have seen these before. We saw a few of them in Wilson's Prom. They've been around, and these things are really iconic in Australia. So funny enough, Australians call these things grass trees because of course Australians are really creative with their names. I mean, grass tree seems pretty obvious. There's another really common name for them though, and that is kangaroo tail. And that's because this is like the flower part of the tree. And this one's getting a bit old, the seed pods have already cracked open and stuff. But when they're quite fresh, this looks and actually feels very, very much like the tail of a kangaroo. Believe it or not, the tail of a kangaroo, it's really strong. It has a lot of muscles in it because they can support their whole body weight from their tail. And so it really is about this thick, the tail of a kangaroo. And it is this kind of dark brown orangey color. And so this is a really good approximation of what a kangaroo tail is actually like. Therefore, these things are called kangaroo tail. And definitely they grow a lot in the deserts in Australia. We'll see more and more of them as we move around. But they always put a smile on my face. They always look so familiar. And these things are really ancient too. You can see where this one's been growing here. It kind of comes out of this like stump-like structure and then grows up, and I think they grow extremely slowly. So this one's probably pretty old. And unfortunately too, they're having a lot of trouble right now. There's this particular fungus that has been attacking and killing them. And so Australia's trying really hard to eradicate that fungus. A lot of the different nature walks and stuff you go on, they have a place where you can clean off your boots so that you don't spread the fungus around, because we want to look after the kangaroo tail. So Yeah, we're just on this track here called the Twin Sisters track. We think there's a couple of big kind of like mountainy, sand dune-y things coming up we don't actually know. And this is what it looks like driving through Little Desert National Park.
We saw a feature labelled Big Dune on the map, and we knew we had to go and check it out. I wasn't seriously trying to get to the top, but I thought it would be good practice to learn how to drive my Gladiator in the deep sand. I lowered the tyre pressures down to 19 psi all around, and I had a few goes at it using different settings and different techniques. At first, I just left the transmission in drive, and I found it really holds onto first gear, and I didn't like that very much. On the second go, I had it in manual mode, and I even had the rear locker engaged. I started out in second and went up to third gear, and I was surprised to find it actually held that gear and it wouldn't go into a lower gear. I didn't know it would do that, and so you can see the second attempt I didn't make it very far. On the third attempt, I had it in manual mode and I revved hard in second, but just as I started to lose speed, I bumped it down to first gear and kept my foot into it, so I aggressively climbed up the hill. You can see I made it a good long way, and I think lower tyre pressures would have really made a big difference here. After all, 19 psi really isn't low enough for deep sand like this. So overall, good learning, and I'm impressed with how the Gladiator performed. I feel confident that I've got a lot more experience now in the deep sand with this thing. I've never had an automatic transmission before, so it's quite an adjustment. It is really nice not to have to worry about the clutch and getting it off the line, but then once I'm actually moving, it's a little bit strange not to be directly in control of which gear the Jeep is actually in. I found too, on the second attempt, I had the rear locker engaged, which you can do in high range four-wheel drive, but it actually just led to a lot of axle tramp, and so I actually left it off on the third run, and I think it went better overall. So I'll have to keep experimenting with that and see if I want to use the locker next time I have to climb a big sand dune, or if I'm better to leave it off. All of these things are about learning, and I need to get more experience as I move around the country and try to drive across all the different surfaces that can possibly be imagined.
Here's another Steve Irwin moment for you guys. So we've just driven up into Big Desert National Park actually, and cruising around checking out some of the campgrounds, and there've been signs everywhere that say feral bees, be careful, feral bees. I didn't really know what that meant. Well, now I do. Check this out. This is obviously some sort of swarm or hive of feral bees, and I'm a little bit scared to get any closer than that, because I don't know how vicious these things are, but I mean, I'm going to assume they're pretty vicious. And for some reason, they've decided to build their house on this tree branch that sways around in the breeze. But you can see there must be like, well, at least 1,000, I don't know, maybe a couple of thousand of bees in this big bunch. So I guess if I was Steve Irwin, I'd be more inclined to actually prod it and cause trouble. But for me, I'm just going to leave them alone. So there we go, after more sandy tracks, we've just come out of Big Desert National Park, and I've just pulled off the side of the gravel road here to air back up the tyres. Obviously I don't want to drive for too long with only 18 psi in the tyres. So all in all, Little Desert and Big Desert, they were really fantastic. We saw a ton of wildlife, some beautiful camping sites, and overall, the sand and the four-wheel driving, it wasn't as challenging as I expected it to be. Other than Big Dune, all of it was pretty straightforward. The Jeep did bog down a few times, and that was almost always when I forgot to turn off traction control. So I'm still literally learning how to drive this thing. And so if you've got a four-wheel drive, you want to learn how to drive it, take it out to a place like this where it's remote and it's wilderness and you can practice in the sand, but it's not the Simpson Desert, it's not the world's most remote road. So, you know, you do have sort of a little bit of safety or a little bit of a backup plan. So I hope you've enjoyed the episode. That was a lot of fun. I'm really enjoying putting together these adventure videos for you guys. If it has been good, do hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. This is just the very beginning of my adventures around Australia. And if you'd like to see where I've been going exactly, I'm posting all my GPS track logs over on Patreon for my supporters over there. So my supporters on Patreon, they get exclusive behind the scenes access, they get early access to my videos, a whole bunch of other perks, and of course the GPS track logs. You can follow along and go exactly where I went on this trip and all future trips. So check that out over on Patreon. There's a link down in the description. And until next time, have fun out there, and maybe I'll bump into you on the road.